big cities were plagued by mob activity in the early 1900s. Mason was a young adult struggling to make ends meet for his family. Mason would always help clean the grocery store down the street for extra cash on the weekends. One night, while walking home from his nightly duties, a car pulls aside Mason. 3 men occupy the vehicle, 2 of which jump out as the driver is yelling, "That's him!" Mason tries to run down the street, but his route was quickly severed by the driver that caught up with him. He's bound and thrown into the trunk. Then, they went to the train tracks. He overhears conversation about a rival boss's son and how this would send a message. Mason begged as they unloaded him from the car. He was ignored as they extended his legs across the track. 2 of the men hammered posts around his legs to prevent escape. Mason continued trying to prove his innocence, but he was eventually gagged with a cloth and rope. The men return to their vehicle and drive along the railroad. They disappear from view just around the small hillside. Mason tried pulling up the posts that were driven into the ground, but they won't budge. He pulls and pulls for hours with no progress. He began yanking on his legs, even tearing his clothing in an attempt to win more space, but all of his efforts were fruitless. The distant sound of a locomotive echoed over the countryside. The moment he heard the train's whistle, Mason's heart sank. He got nauseous, his stomach twisting into a tornado of fear and an abrupt realization as to what he's about to endure. He began violently pulling his legs. One pops out of socket as Mason screams in pain, the train now roaring closer. In the hopes of saving one of his legs, Mason tries to loosen a post. The train, blaring a deafeningly loud horn, Mason had ran out of time. The locomotive sped across the track and, horrifically, amputates his legs. Mason feels the air touching his leg tissue in spots he'd never felt air before. An unbearable, stinging sensation and a cold feeling, as if his blood had been frozen. Mason gazes at his missing limbs, drunk from pain and adrenaline. He still feels queasy and increasingly more lightheaded. Mason's survival instincts kick in. He wedges out the remainder of his legs and uses clothing to tie off the areas. He peers around to see any nearby signs of life. Along the railroad is a long dirt road that stretches for miles in either direction. Mason shuffles around his body, where he gazes across many acres of blackberry bushes and spots a small farmhouse. Mason struggles to crawl as he makes his way to the start of the patches. He's eye to eye with the wall of thorned berries. He tucks his head down, crying and moaning from the pain, then begins crawling into the thorns. His entire body was scratched and cut, the spare clothing he'd affixed to his wounds filling up with blood. He makes it to the end of the jungle of twisting thorns and pain, his blood levels vastly diminished, operating on pure adrenaline. A slow trail of blood dragging out of the thorn patch behind him. He knocks on the door and screams as loudly as he could bear. The door slowly opens, and he peers up at the same men that had brought him there.